next lesson on why focus on Israel. As we've been looking at a number of different things, we've been looking at it just briefly. We're not looking at these things in detail. At other times, at other classes, we will look at detail on some of these things in much, much greater detail. But now we're just trying to get an overview of why focus on Israel. Why should Christians, Bible believers, focus on Israel? Well, today's lesson, the church, though not unimportant, is a parenthetical focus in the plan of God. God's plan revolves around the nation of Israel. He focuses on Israel and the Jewish people. When we looked earlier at the scriptures and considered that from Genesis 12 to the end of Revelation, some 85% of that material is given over to Israel and the Jewish people. Just the sheer volume of that material should convince us of the importance of focusing on Israel and the Jewish people if we're going to rightly divide the word of truth, understand the word of God. So as we look at our lesson on the church as being a parenthetical focus in the plan of God, please don't misunderstand this statement, that the church is a parenthetical focus in the plan of God. Does not mean that the church is unimportant. The church is very important. Dr. Andy Woods, who is the pastor of Sugarland Bible Church in Sugarland, Texas, comments on the church as a parenthetical focus in the plan of God. He says this: the notion that the present interim age came about as a consequence of Israel's rejection of the kingdom offer in no way implies that it is an afterthought or less important in God's mind in comparison to his program with national Israel. On the contrary, according to Ephesians 3:11, the church was, quote, in accordance with God's, quote, eternal purpose. In other words, God always knew and purposed that he would create and work through the church. Although Israel's program is revealed in the Old Testament, the church's program is unrevealed. However, this distinction does not mean that God's unrevealed program for the church is of less importance than his revealed program for Israel. Furthermore, although the church represents an interruption or parenthesis between God's past and future dealings with Israel, this in no way implies that the church is of lesser importance than God's past or future dealings with national Israel. The dictionary definition of a parenthesis simply conveys the idea of an interval rather than something of less importance. Thus, understanding the church as a parenthetical break in this manner in no way suggests that the church represents Plan B in relation to God's purposes for Israel. So please don't misunderstand the importance of the church, or perhaps you're thinking unimportance of the church. No, the church is not some byproduct, some afterthought in the mind of God. It was always there. But do understand that the entirety, if you will, or the focus primarily of God's plan is around Israel and the Jewish people. And even in a sense, in this day of the church age. Presently in this age, the age of the church, God is calling out a remnant of Jews, Romans 11, 1 through 5, and a remnant, if we want to use that term, of Gentiles, Acts 15, 13 through 17. In Romans 11, we are told this. I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I, Paul speaking, also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew. Wot ye not which the scripture says of Elijah, how he makes intercession to God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed thy prophets, dig down thine altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. But what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Even so, then, at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. There has always been a remnant within the Jewish nation, among the Jewish people, who have believed the biblical message about the God of Israel and his Messiah. At Elijah's time, there were 7,000. The true believing remnant of Israel today are Jewish believers in Jesus. Not the ultra-Orthodox in Judaism, but Jewish believers in Jesus are the believing, true, the remnant of Israel today. Interestingly, that puts Jewish believers who are in the church, which is made up of Jew and Gentile, but also as part of the nation of Israel. I am Jewish. I'm a believer in Jesus. I do not lose my identification with the nation of Israel. I am one of thousands today who have put their trust in the Messiah of Israel, what Paul refers to as the remnant. I am part of Israel, the believing remnant, but I am also part of the church. In Acts 15, we are told this. And after they had held their peace, James answered, saying, Men and brethren, hearken unto me. Simeon, Peter had declared how God at the first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And that's the key phrase. To take out of them a people for his name. To this agree the words of the prophets, as it is written. After this I will return and will build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down, and I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up, that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who doeth all these things. God is calling today a people for his name out of the expanse of Gentile humanity, or if we want to use that term, remnant. Not used here, but out of the expanse of Gentile humanity, there's a smaller part that have come and will come to the Lord, a people for his name. So there is a minority of Jewish people and a minority of Gentiles today who call upon the name of the Lord, who accept the Lord, who accept biblical revelation and biblical truth. The church, made up of believing Jew and believing Gentile today, is not mentioned in the earlier scriptures, the Old Testament, or the Tanakh, as the Jewish people refer to it. It's brought into existence on the day of Pentecost, Acts 2, and it's removed from God's plan with a rapture prior to the tribulation period, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 through 18. Romans 11 addresses both Jews in verses 1 through 5, and Gentiles, verse 13, who are believers. In verse 13, for I speak to you Gentiles, Paul says, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. Paul, speaking to the Gentiles and what he is sharing with them is not because he is Jewish and has a burden for his brethren, his kinsmen, according to the flesh, but he is magnifying his office, his apostleship. He was called by God as the apostle to the Gentiles. So he's addressing Gentiles. Now, we're going to look at Romans chapter 11, 16 through 24. We're going to start it in this lesson. And we are told in verse 16, "For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches." Now, in the context, the first fruit and the root represent the Abrahamic covenant and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. First fruit and root represent the Abrahamic covenant. The lump and the branches represent the nation of Israel, which is holy, chosen of God, set apart by God. So the first fruit and the root is the Abrahamic covenant. The lump and the branches are that which comes from the Abrahamic covenant and the patriarchs, which is the nation of Israel. Dough, of course, is bread, dough. A part of the dough was offered to God as a token that all of it was acceptable. Now, this comes from J. Vernon McGee and is through the Bible commentary. The first fruit evidently refers to the origin of the nation of Israel, he says. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Holy has no reference to any moral quality, but to the fact that it was set apart for God. Now at the first fruit, or the first dough, that little bit of dough, was set apart for God. What about the whole harvest? Since Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were set apart for God, what about the nation? It all belongs to God, you see. God is not through with the nation Israel. J. Vernon McGee was very clear and correct on his understanding of this. Warren Wiersbe said this about this passage in Romans 11. The reference is to Numbers 15, 17 through 21. The first part of the dough was to be offered up to God as a symbol that the entire lump belonged to him. The same idea was involved in the Feast of First Fruits, when the priest offered a sheaf to the Lord as a token that the entire harvest was his. Leviticus 23, 9 through 14. The basic idea is that when God accepts the part, he sanctifies the whole. Applying this to the history of Israel, we understand Paul's argument. God accepted the founder of the nation, Abraham, and in so doing set apart his descendants as well. God also accepted the other patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob, in spite of their sins or failings. This means that God must accept the rest of the lump, the nation of Israel. Warren Wiersbe understands exactly what is being spoken of here in Romans chapter 11. Verse 17 goes on and tells us this. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partakes of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So, verse 17, the sum of the branches be broken off is the entire context of this passage. Or in the entire context of this passage are the Jews, the nation, and the majority of the nation is unbelieving. The wild olive tree represents the church, but primarily the Gentiles who make up the vast majority of the church. Remember, Paul said, I speak unto you Gentiles, which receive the blessing of the Abrahamic covenant, the spiritual blessings. Now, it's likely that the branches broken off speak of the nation of Israel, represented here by unbelieving Jews. And the branches not broken off would be Jewish believers in Jesus. The remnant spoken of in verses 1 through 5 were part of the church. Look at the verse again. And if some of the branches be broken off, unbelieving Jews, the nation of Israel, and thou being a wild olive tree, and that's the Gentiles, were grafted in among them, the ones that weren't broken off, and with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Dr. Charles Ryrie agrees that, quote, the olive tree is the place of privilege that was first occupied by the natural branches, the Jews. The wild branches, he says, are Gentiles who, because of the unbelief of Israel, now occupy the place of privilege. The root of the tree is the Abrahamic covenant that promised blessing to both Jew and Gentile through Christ. And then in verses 18 through 20 it says this, boast not against the branches. The branches is speaking of Israel. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Speaking to the Gentiles. What is your foundation? The Abrahamic covenant. Verse 19. Thou wilt say, then the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, that's correct. Because of unbelief, they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fair. You've well said, that is true. The branches were broken off, the unbelieving Jews. Israel was set aside as a nation because of unbelief, and you were grafted in because of your belief, your faith. But don't be high-minded. Don't be lifted up with pride and arrogance. Here we have a warning given to the predominantly Gentile church not to be boastful or high-minded, arrogant in speaking against Israel, the Jews, the branches. Stephen Cole, with Precept Ministries, wrote this. The olive tree represents, in the broadest sense, the people of God. In the Old Testament era, this was Israel, made up of both believers and unbelievers. It now is composed of the church in the broadest sense, made up of believers, but also of some that profess to believe, but are not true believers. If I can add, like it was in Israel. These are the ones that Paul warns may be cut off. God is able to graft the Jews back into the people of God if they do not continue in their unbelief. Romans 11:23. But he goes on and says, but we need to stay focused on Paul's main purpose for this illustration, namely, to confront any spiritual pride on the part of Gentiles in the church. Don't be high-minded, arrogant, prideful. And to confront any anti-Semitism stemming from such pride that would choke out zeal for evangelizing the Jews. Since the root of both problems was spiritual pride, we'll focus on how to guard against this dangerous sin. See, the whole context of this passage in verses 12 through 15 of Romans 11 is bringing the gospel, evangelizing Jewish people. It can have a profound effect on the world and the number of Gentiles coming to the Lord. But instead, the warning is, don't be lifted up with pride, Gentiles, and become arrogant. And Cole nails the issue and the concern here. And then it goes on in verse 21. For if God spared not the natural branches, Take heed lest he also spare not thee. God set aside Israel, the natural branches. He can do the same to the church, which are the unnatural branches, the wild olive tree. God setting Israel aside in his plan because of their unbelief, he will do the same to the church, speaking primarily to the Gentile portion, if they become boastful and arrogant. And in verse 22 of Romans 11, it goes on, behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee, goodness. Then look at the condition. If thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. We have a contrast here between God's goodness and his severity. Israel's unbelief brought God's severity upon them. They were set aside. God's goodness or usefulness, perhaps a better term, will remain with the church as long as the church remains useful. If not, the church will be cut off. Verse 23. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. If Israel believes in Messiah, in Jesus, God will graft them back into the olive tree. This is what God promises will ultimately happen. Isaiah 66, 5 through 13. Ezekiel 39, 25 through 29. Many verses. It's detailed in later verses in this chapter of Romans, Romans chapter 11. But if God could graft in a wild olive tree, which is against nature, certainly he can graft in the natural branches. Verse 24. For if thou were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and was grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? It's logical. If God can graft in a wild olive tree to a good olive tree, Gentiles, the church, which is not normal, certainly he can graft the natural branches of the olive tree back in. Jewish people when they accept Jesus as Messiah. What we've seen here, and we will pick this up in the next lesson, the Abrahamic covenant is the root of who we are and what we believe. God set aside Israel temporarily because of her rebellion, her sin, her unbelief. And the warning to Gentiles, I speak to you Gentiles, as your apostle, Paul said, is understand you were grafted in contrary to nature. And if you become arrogant and high-minded, I can cast you away. I can cut you off, just like I did Israel. And the entire context is in the context of reaching Jewish people with the gospel. Now, our next lesson, we will pick this up and finish our look at the church as a parenthetical thought, but Israel the focus of God's plan. Until next time, shalom.